Hi, my name is Kristen Whitko, and I am with the City of Boulder. I'm the Energy Code Coordinator, and this webinar is going to be a quick training on the new 2020 City of Boulder Residential Energy Conservation Code. This is one of two webinars I'll be recording. The second one is on the Commercial Energy Conservation Code, and these presentations, along with other information on the code, can be found at www.boulderenergycode.com. The agenda for this presentation, I'm going to talk about the adoption process for the 2020 Energy Code and the effective date, and then I'll summarize the general requirements for the 2020 Residential Energy Code, talk a little bit about the documentation requirements, and then close out talking about project inspection and project closeout procedures. So City Council adopted the 2020 Energy Code on March 3rd, 2020, after an over a year-long effort that included technical consultants, community engagement, and multiple check-ins with both Planning Board and City Council. At the same time that Council adopted the 2020 Energy Code, they also adopted the full suite of 2018 I-codes, so the International Building Code, the Residential Code, Plumbing, Mechanical, and Fire, as well as a new code, which is the International Existing Building Code, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. At the time of adoption, they adopted an effective date of July 1, 2020, with no grandfathering. So as of July 1st, 2020, all new projects coming in for permit will need to meet both the 2020 City of Boulder Energy Conservation Code, as well as all of the 2018 I-code requirements. Boulder updates our energy code every 3 years. We have an energy code roadmap that moves us towards a net zero energy code by 2031 that requires us to do a code update every 3 years to help us incrementally move towards that broader goal. The current code we're working on is the 2017 City of Boulder Energy Conservation Code, and we'll be moving to the 2020 City of Boulder Energy Conservation Code. Similar to how the 2017 code was based on the 2012 National Code, the new 2020 code that we're adopting is based on and is very similar to the 2018 International Energy Conservation Code. So the national code that exists, our code is built off of that and then made to be 20% more stringent than that national code. But the framework and the way the code is set up and the language is very similar. So for jurisdictions that work in for consultants that work in other jurisdictions, this code should look very familiar. So in this webinar, we'll be talking about the Residential Energy Code, and the first thing relevant is the definition. So the definition for residential buildings, as far as the energy code goes, includes detached 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses, and group R3 and R4 buildings 3 stories or less in height above grade plane with separate means of egress. Anything that doesn't fall into that definition would be treated as a commercial building. So the energy code is divided into 2 distinct sections, the Residential Energy Code and the Commercial Energy Code. All buildings that meet the residential definition will need to meet the residential provisions of the code, and all other projects will need to meet the commercial provisions in the code. Okay, so this flowchart starts to look at the specific requirements for different types of projects. Under the residential code, there are new construction projects, additions, and then alterations and repairs. And then within each of those, there are different thresholds as well. So for new construction, projects are either under 500 square foot or over 500 square foot. For projects under 500 square feet, the project just needs to meet the mandatory and prescriptive requirements in the code. For projects over 500 square feet, the projects will need to meet the mandatory requirements in the code, and then will need to hit an ERI score for new construction. So there's an ERI calculator online that we'll go to later in the presentation, and you'll need to plug in your square footage, and based on the square footage, you'll have to hit a target ERI. The larger the home, the more stringent the ERI requirement. And ERI is just an energy rating index. It's the same, it's very comparable to the HERS score. The next category is additions. Again, less than 1,000 square feet, greater than 1,000 square feet. Those are the two triggers within additions. Under 1,000 square feet, similar to the new construction projects under 500 square feet, those projects just need to meet the mandatory and prescriptive requirements in the code for the scope of work of that project. Additions over 1,000 square feet need to meet the mandatory provisions in the code, and they need to hit an ERI score that's 30% than the existing home that's there prior to the alteration. So projects like this will need to do an ERI, a HERS rating or an ERI, obtain a HERS rating or an ERI score for the home prior to any alterations being made, and then use that and take 30% off that. And that becomes the target for the home plus the addition, is getting to a home that has an ERI score 30% less than what the existing ERI score is for the project. And then the third category is alterations and repairs. And this is where we'll talk a little bit about the International Existing Building Code. Within that code, which is a new code to Boulder, there are levels of alteration that are established and definitions for them, and those are listed on this slide. So a level 1 alteration is an alteration with scope that includes the removal and replacement or the covering of existing materials, elements, equipment, or fixtures using new materials, elements, equipment, or fixtures that serve the same purpose. So that's a level 1 alteration. A level 2 alteration with a scope that includes the reconfiguration of space, the addition or elimination of any door or window, the reconfiguration or extension of any system, or the installation of any additional equipment. And then a level 3 alteration is an alteration where the work area exceeds 50% of the building area. And then finally, a level 4 alteration is an alteration where the work area both exceeds 50% of the building area and mechanical and lighting systems are substantially replaced, and the alteration meets the criteria of substantial structural alteration, including fenestration replacement. So a level 4 alteration is kind of a gut renovation. So based on those definitions, the requirements in the energy code are built off of those. So level 1 and level 2 alterations, those projects only need to meet the mandatory and prescriptive requirements in the energy code for, again, the scope of work. So it doesn't expand beyond the scope of work of the project. And then a level 3 alteration, but less than a level 4 alteration, must hit the mandatory provisions in the code. And similar to additions greater than 1,000 square feet, they need to have a before and after ERI score, and they need to demonstrate that the ERI score is 30% better than the existing. And then a level 4 alteration is very much treated as new construction. If you're doing a gut renovation and you can basically see through the home and you've taken all, basically gutted it, you need to hit the ERI score based on the new construction calculator, but you get a 10% buffer. So if the new construction requirement was that you hit an ERI of 20, you get 20 plus 10%, and that becomes your ERI target. So on the previous slide, we talked about requirements for the various project types, additions, renovations, alterations. And regardless of the type of project, all projects need to meet the mandatory provisions in the code. There are over 50 mandatory provisions in the code. Not all of them apply to all projects. Not all projects have a swimming pool. Not all projects have certain domestic water heating systems, but there are 50 requirements, and there's a checklist that goes with that. And if your project includes scope that relates to the mandatory provisions, you'll have to make sure that your scope complies with these provisions. And the provisions include things for how the thermal envelope is depicted, NFRC ratings, continuous air barriers, corner and header insulation, rim joist insulation and air sealing details, how the floor is insulated, shaft penetration, air sealing, garage separation, narrow cavity insulation, air leakage testing requirements, recessed lighting needing to be IC rated, programmable thermostats, duct insulation and sealing, building cavities not allowed to be used as ducts, pipe insulation, snow melt controls, renewable energy offsets, and then there are pool heating controls and cover requirements, high efficiency lighting fixture requirements, EV charging, and solar ready requirements. And if your project, the project has any scope related to any of these things, these mandatory provisions need to be met. The biggest difference with Boulder's residential energy code relative to the National Energy Code, and the biggest difference between the 2017 Boulder Code and the 2020 Boulder Code, is that we have ERI requirements that are significantly more stringent. So this graph is showing square footage across the x-axis, and then the ERI score that projects are required to achieve. And this is for new construction. And again, the ERI is the same as a HERS score. The blue line shows the 2017 ERI requirements. So if you're building a new home under the current code, based on the square footage, those are your requirements. The orange line, which is showing the 2020 requirements, are what will be required as of July 1st. So as you can see, any project over 5,000 square feet currently has to be a net zero energy home. With the new code, anything greater than a home of 3,000 square foot will need to be net zero energy. And the requirements for smaller homes go up to a HERS of 50 under the new requirements. So the range is between a HERS of 50 and a HERS of 0 based on the size of the home. You can also see future code iterations. We're moving basically, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, towards a net zero energy code, which is the green line, where all new construction will need to be net zero energy. But for now, the orange line is what will be effective as of July 1. Another change to talk about is the U value and R value requirements. We've increased the stringency on how glazing needs to perform in Boulder. The national code numbers are a little bit less stringent than this. For fenestration, glass will need to hit a U factor of 0.27, and for skylights, 0.5. And we're also implementing something called an envelope backstop, so that projects, even projects that are complying with the code via the ERI path, still need to hit these minimum R values and maximum U values. They can't, the ERI path allows you to trade off some efficiencies here and there, but we're basically not allowing the envelope to be traded off. We're prioritizing the performance of the envelope and not allowing people to take credit for that and make up for it with either better mechanical systems or better lighting or solar on the project. What we want to see is this minimum level of performance in the building envelope. The next change to talk about in the residential code is the requirement for renewable offsets for all outdoor heating. So snow melt systems, spas, pools, any outdoor heating that you're doing on a residential project needs to be completely offset by renewables. So the amount of energy that those systems consume annually needs to be offset by solar generated on site annually. And this part of the code very much mimics what the county is already doing. Our requirements are going to be the same as what they've required for the past few years. Speaking of renewables and solar requirements, with this code, we've created a last resort compliance path with something we're calling the Energy Impact Offset Fund. So where projects are required need some amount of solar to meet the ERI requirements. If a project needs to hit a net zero energy, an ERI of 0, those projects often need to deploy solar to hit that ERI score. And in cases where they can't do that on site due to shading or orientation or any number of reasons where that's not technically feasible on site, the next step is to go to community solar, but in some cases we've had instances where community solar isn't available. It's sort of, it's not always predictable whether or not community solar will be available for every single project. So in cases where on-site solar is not possible and community solar is not available, we've created a third compliance path when a project needs solar, and those projects can pay into the Energy Impact Offset Fund. And that the price of what they pay is described in the code, but that just gives us a third path so that projects always have a path to compliance. The next significant change and this isn't so much in the energy code, but this is in sort of sustainability requirements, is around construction and demolition waste. Boulder has had construction and demolition waste requirements for over a decade built into our code. What's changing in this code is some of the metrics. Under the current code, we exempt things like concrete and asphalt, and we're changing that to sort of align with the LEED requirements. And the new requirement is that all demolition projects divert 75% of debris from a landfill and for reuse or recycling. And these requirements are being expanded into the commercial sector as well. So previously this is only applied to residential demolition projects. It's now applies to also commercial projects. On the residential side, it applies to demo projects as well as level 4 alteration. So if you're doing that gut renovation that we talked about earlier in the presentation, you also have to meet this requirement of diverting 75% of the demo material from a landfill. Another significant change to this is to sort of increase enforceability around this. We've created a refundable deposit. And what this means is that when you apply for a demo permit, you will be asked to put down a deposit equivalent to $1 per square foot of the project that you're demoing. And that deposit will be returned to you once you can prove and demonstrate that you've reused and recycled according to your demolition waste plan. Okay, so moving on to energy code documentation requirements. Based on the type of project you have, whether it's new construction, addition, or alteration, the materials that you'll need to have at the time of permit application will vary. So if you have a project that only needs to comply with the mandatory and prescriptive requirements in the code, you'll just need to go to the website, download the mandatory checklist and the prescriptive checklist. These are checklists that are customized to Boulder's code that outline each of the provisions in the code. And you just need to demonstrate where in your construction documents and specifications you're complying with each of those requirements. If you have a project that also has an ERI requirement and needs to hit a certain HERS score or an ERI score, you'll also need to provide the mandatory checklist. So you'll need to download and complete that just like the other projects. And then you'll also need to provide a projected ERI rating from a HERS provider. And these checklists can all be found at www.boulderenergycode.com, along with a bunch of other really useful information. This slide just shows what the landing page for www.boulderenergycode.com looks like. And basically, a lot of the really important information that you'll need and the checklist that I talked about in the previous slide can be found here in this right sidebar. It also gives an overview of the code here, talks about the effective date, talks about the goals and objectives for the city's energy code, sort of the long-term plan, a little bit about what net zero energy is, highlighting the energy code changes with this round, and then sort of summarizes the requirements of the residential and commercial energy code, and then has some training materials tucked in a little bit below. But the really important resources that you need for permit application are all really found in this right sidebar. I'll also point out that my contact information is in the sidebar as well, so if you ever have questions, you can feel free to reach out to me using that contact info. There are some specific documentation requirements that are identified in the code, and the checklist kind of covers these, but I'll just draw attention to them because some of them are new and will be newly enforced with this code cycle. One in particular is that the building thermal envelope shall be represented in the construction documents. So we want to really clearly understand where the thermal envelope is in the project for many reasons, to make sure so that we can sort of identify, and the project team can just sort of highlight how the air sealing and air leakage is being done around rim joist and corner details and penetrations. Another important factor is whether the mechanical equipment is inside the thermal envelope or outside. That sort of triggers other requirements around duct leakage testing and things like that. So the construction documents need to clearly identify where that thermal envelope is. Other general information that plan reviewers are going to be looking for on your plans are, your foundation wall insulation, your roof and ceiling insulation, slab on grade and perimeter insulation, how that's being accomplished, above grade wall insulation, the rim joist insulation, cantilevered floor insulation. All these things really need to be identified on the plan. If it's a project that just needs to meet the prescriptive requirements, plan reviewers are going to be looking for those prescriptive requirements to be met. If it's a project that needs to hit an ERI, the plan reviewers are going to be looking at these criteria to make sure that they match the ERI reports that are being turned in that show what ERI score the project's achieving. Another really important thing that we're looking for both at plan review and during inspection is window U factors and solar heat gain coefficients and UA alternative calculations if that's the method you're going for in terms of compliance. But the U factors need to be identified on the plans, either in the notes, the specifications, window schedules, just somewhere in the project specifications. U factors should be no less than 0.27 for windows on projects that need to comply with the 2020 code. Once the project gets into construction, and inspectors are going to be looking to verify the NFRC labels. Every window should have an NFRC label. If not, we'll be looking for an alternate certificate of compliance for those windows. For mechanical systems, mechanical design criteria, we're going to be looking for manual J. Again, the plan reviewers are going to be looking for manual J and manual S calculations. Those need to be submitted with the permit application. Mechanical systems and service hot water heating systems, equipment types, sizes, efficiencies, and locations need to be clearly identified on the plans. The ductwork needs to be identified. We need to determine whether or not it's inside or outside the thermal envelope. Equipment and system controls need to be specified. One very specific thing is programmable thermostats need to be specified on all projects. And this all needs to show up in the construction document so that it can be verified at plan review and then again during the inspection. Duct sealing, duct and pipe insulation requirements. There are requirements in the code based on where your ducts are located and what kind of ductwork and what kind of piping it is. All of that needs to be identified on the plans. And again, clearly identifying inside or outside the thermal envelope for ductwork, and where it is outside the thermal envelope, we'll also be looking for a specification that the ductwork be duct leakage tested so that when the inspectors are out on the project, they're not the ones informing the project that duct leakage testing is required, but that's actually on the drawings as well. Finally, I'll talk about air sealing details and air leakage in general. The code requires all new construction be air leakage tested and meet those requirements in the code, but additionally, it requires that projects show air sealing details in the construction documents. So, how to seal up light fixtures, how to seal up rim joist, energy heels, around windows, just all kinds of details. There's a bunch of resources online. This shows the Department of Energy's website and shows that they have a bunch of CAD files that have some pre-drawn details that you can load onto plans. But again, the plan reviewers are going to be looking for these kinds of details to make sure that air sealing is successfully detailed so the projects can meet that air leakage testing requirement at the end of the job. So finally, I just want to take a few minutes and talk about the project closeout after, as you're wrapping up construction. During the construction process, there are key inspections that are called out within the energy code. At footing and foundation, our inspectors are going to be looking for compliance with R values, the location, thickness, and depth of insulation. During framing and rough-in, they're going to be verifying the type of insulation and corresponding R values and their correct location and proper installation. We'll be looking at glass properties, looking for those NFRC labels for U factor and solar heat gain coefficient, proper installation, air leakage controls. At plumbing rough-ins, they'll be verifying the type of installation and corresponding R values and protection, as well as the required controls. Mechanical rough-in, verifying that the installed HVAC equipment meets what's on the plans, has the required controls in the code, has the insulation that's required with the right R values. Again, looking at air leakage control for ductwork and ductwork testing, programmable thermostats, dampers, whole house ventilation. And then at final, they're going to be verifying the installation of all required building systems, equipment and controls, and proper operation of all that equipment, plus taking a look at the required number of high efficiency lamps and fixtures. Something you might hear city staff talking about on construction projects is our building conditions. And these are important as you're trying to close out a project. As the plan reviewers review projects, they load on a number of building conditions that are relevant to that project. Building conditions that you're likely to see on a residential project are one, a condition that is requiring a final confirmed ERI. So at the end of the project, projects that are required to hit a certain ERI score need to submit from their HERS rater a confirmed ERI that shows that the ERI they said they were going to achieve during permit application, they have in fact achieved, and that they've met that code requirement. Another building condition you might see is requirements for air leakage testing and the requirement to submit those results to the city. Again, that's a code requirement that all new construction obtain air leakage testing and hit the tightness requirements identified in the code, and at the end of the project, until you submit that building condition can't be resolved. And then another one that projects will see is the NFRC label verification. We just need to be sure that the U factor that was identified in the permit application for the project has been achieved on all of the windows being installed on the project. And you can't close out a project and get the final certificate of occupancy and close it up without resolving all of the building conditions on a project. So how do you resolve them? It basically requires that you use the online customer service portal, and you can upload this information to that portal, and then it gets routed to either the plan reviewer or to myself to then resolve these energy code conditions. And there are other conditions that are placed on the project related to flood and zoning, but the energy code conditions, that's how they're resolved. Similar to the other conditions, you upload the information on our online customer self-service portal, and then staff can go on and resolve those conditions so that you can move forward with your project closeout. And that is all I had for this webinar. I hope is that you have a better understanding of what's in the 2020 residential energy code, as well as the documentation requirements to meet those requirements and how to successfully navigate the process. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address again is here, but it's also on the website that I showed earlier in the webinar. Thanks for listening.